So our speaker today is Dr. Lila Landowski. Dr. Landowski is a multi-award winning neuroscientist and a lecturer at the University of Tasmania. She is an Executive Director of the Australian Society for Medical Research, a Director of Epilepsy Tasmania, and a regular guest expert science communicator for the ABC. Lila was Australian Institute of Policy and Science Young Tall Poppy in 2018 and Tasmanian finalist for the Young Australian of the Year in 2016. Her research background spans stroke, nanotechnology, fatigue, dementia, axon guidance and peripheral nerve regeneration. As a thought leader in science and science advocacy, Lila's honorary titles include being a superstar of STEM, an ambassador for public school education, a patron of National Science Week, and being named a science superhero by Australia's chief scientist. So I have to say, Lila, some amazing resumes across the desk of the Royal Society. I don't know how you've packed all that into your years so far. And a further thing I'd like to mention is that we have some of Lila's teachers from her former school with us today, and I know that they hold Lila in particularly high regard. So that's a wonderful tribute, Lila, to what you've achieved. Now, Lila's talk today is called Brain Hack, Sharing the Secrets to Productive Learning backed by Neuroscience. So we're all looking forward to learning those tips, Lila. So it's with great pleasure I hand the screen over to you. Thank you.
Very much. No pressure. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'm both a lecturer and a neuroscientist, and as a lecturer there's a lot of teaching pedagogy out there, but not much of it is actually backed by neuroscience. So here today what I wanted to do was to talk to you a little bit about how we can actually learn better, how we can learn faster and use neuroscience to become better learners ourselves. And hopefully by the end of this lecture I'll be able to empower you with some tools that'll help you to do this at home. So we'll start at the beginning. This is a brain, a fresh human brain. Might be a bit confronting to look at, but whether you're aware of it or not, the brain controls everything that you're doing, whether you're thinking about it or not. And its priority is survival. So first and foremost, it is here to keep us alive. And we know this because, for example, when we're stressed, you lose a lot of your most sophisticated behaviours. You'll focus on surviving in that moment. You might be more aggressive, you might be more defensive, and you're not really thinking about your complex personality and those sorts of attributes to you as a person. And that's not an accident, and that's because above everything else, our priority is survival. And, to survive, we sometimes need to revert to those more primitive behaviours. And in order to survive, we need to learn. We need to learn and we need to adapt to deal with those different situations. And in order to learn and to adapt, our brain needs to physically change. So the brain is all about change. It gives us this ability to learn and to do new things. And all of our individual skills and abilities are really shaped by our environment and our lived experiences. And you might think that a talented person has something special about them, some magic thing that the rest of us doesn't have. But the reality is it mostly comes down to training, perseverance, and the timing of when you learnt that skill. So, great footy players aren't born, they're trained. How do we know that? Well, think of a baby. A baby will do things 1,000 times wrong before they do it right. And, that's because they haven't been shaped by their experiences yet. Here's me playing my first proper game of footy. I probably look like I know what I'm doing. It's just clever photography. I was useless and I still am because I haven't trained. So the good news is that you can be better at anything that you are in this moment if you set yourself up for learning. So the catch is when you're learning something, your brain is changing subtly. You're making brand new connections between different parts of the brain. Just play this video here. So it's when you're making new memories, when you're learning, it's a bit like wearing a path in a forest. So it's a bit like walking back and forth a lot. You turn that pathway into a road, then you turn it into a highway. And as soon as you turn those pathways in your brain into highways, you can think a lot more fast and a lot more clearly. So when we're learning new things, we're creating these new highways in the brain. And creating new highways in the brain takes a lot of energy. That's why learning is so exhausting, because you're literally making new pathways in the brain. So the brain works the same way when we think more generally. So for example, if you're someone who has quite a negative outlook on life, and you always say negative things when someone proposes something to you, that is really, if you consistently do something like think with negative thoughts, those pathways in the brain become the most well-worn, they become the highways, and that becomes your way of thinking. So what you're looking at here, these are neurons that I've imaged. They're 2 neurons from a rat brain, which I've removed, and it's sitting in a petri dish. So you can see these 2 arms of the neurons, they're called growth cones, and they're reaching out to one another, forming a connection. That's not exactly what happens in the brain. So when you're actually forming new memories and learning, you're making much smaller connections between new neurons. But I thought it's a beautiful representation of what's happening in our brain as we're growing and developing. Okay, so that's all well and good, but how do we actually learn better? What are the ingredients to help us learn? Our recipe for learning is made of a few key ingredients. So you need neuroplasticity, you need to make errors, you need repetition, and you need to rewire the brain. So I'll take you through this over the next few slides. So what is neuroplasticity? So neuroplasticity is our brain, our nervous system's ability to change in response to different experiences. So people often overstate how plastic our brain is. You know, people say that if we tie our shoelaces differently, then our brain is changing itself. It's not that easy, and you'll find out why in just a moment. So what we're looking at here are brains from children from 5 years through to 20 years. And what you're looking at is the amount of grey matter in the brain. So if there's lots of grey matter, it's showing up as red to yellow. And if there's less grey matter, it's showing up as blue to purple. So fundamentally speaking, kids have more potential to learn than adults, right? And we can see that through this brain imaging. So the grey matter is the part of the brain that is full of all these brain connections. It's full of all these roads. And as we hit about age 13 for boys and age 11 for girls, the amount of grey matter starts to decrease, which sounds bad, right? So your brain is actually shrinking. But that's good, because what's happening during that period is you're getting more of these highways. You're getting rid of the little roads. You've just got a lot more of these highways, and we're having a lot more of this. Our brain is essentially refining itself to its adult form. And that development continues up until about age 25. So once we hit around our mid-20s, then our brain is, as we would consider to be, fully developed. And it's interesting that this happens in girls before it happens in boys, which is pretty consistent with what we observe about maturity. So the last part of our brain to go through this refinement process is our frontal lobe. This is the part of our brain which is involved in decision making. So it makes sense why us as teenagers tend to make some pretty bad decisions. It's because that part of the brain isn't developed yet, isn't fully developed. So there's a bit of a scapegoat there if you've ever made some bad decisions in the past. So neuroplasticity happens easily in young brains, okay? It's switched on most of the time. Your ability to learn and to take on new information is very easy. You know, kids just need to be exposed to stuff in order to learn. But as we get older, our brain connections become more refined, and as they do that, it becomes harder to learn. So it doesn't mean that an old dog can't learn new tricks, it just means that it's a lot harder to learn new tricks. And unfortunately, all of us here today are what we would consider old dogs. So it is harder to learn, but it is not impossible. So what we actually needed to do in order to learn is to open up that window for neuroplasticity again. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that, as I'm about to show you. So in order to get neuroplasticity happening as an adult, we need a few different ingredients. So we need neurotransmitters in the brain, such as dopamine, adrenaline, and acetylcholine. Don't worry if you can't remember those. I just wanted to give you lots of information and you can choose whether it's relevant to you or not. So dopamine is really important because it motivates you. It makes you decide what you want to do and it allows you to have this neuroplasticity happen. Adrenaline is really important for your alertness, so you're alert and able to focus on that thing that you're learning. And acetylcholine is also really important for your focus, so your ability to hone in on that thing that you're trying to learn. So you need to be able to focus and to be alert if you want any chance of being motivated and to learn something new. So attention and focus is a really important sense. So for example, if I was to ask you to clasp your hands and, suddenly you'd be aware of this contact of one skin surface on the other, you'd be aware of the temperature of your hands, the texture of your skin. So putting attention onto something allows you to be suddenly aware of things that you weren't aware of. So it's a really important sense, but unless you're actually putting your attention onto something like that, you can quite easily go through life and not be aware that those things are happening. So attention is incredibly important if you want to learn. So first things first, we have a limit to our focus. So we have this thing called an ultradian rhythm, which is a 90-minute cycle of alertness. So every 90 minutes, we become distracted and then alert and focused and then distracted again. So regardless of what you're doing, you're going to be constantly fluctuating out of this in this cycle every day. And research suggests that your attention, your focus is really limited to learning bouts of 8 to 30 minutes per cycle. So you really want to be in the middle of that 90-minute cycle if you have a good chance of being focused. So I realise that through the course of this lecture, you're probably going to lose your focus for a bit, and that's okay. I'm not judging because that's neuroscience. So how can we actually increase this alertness and focus? So you might have heard of the fight or flight response or our sympathetic nervous system. So basically, whenever our fight or flight response is active, we're releasing dopamine, acetylcholine, and noradrenaline. So who can tell me ways that we might activate our fight or flight system? Anyone have any suggestions? Yeah, doing something risky, absolutely. Yep. Exercise, getting into an argument, being angry, lots of different things. So there's lots of different ways in which we can actually activate our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response, and that in that moment afterwards, your brain is primed for learning. So you have the best chance of taking in new information. We know that if you're exercising for about 5 minutes, even just doing star jumps, getting the blood flowing, your attention and focus is increased for 2 to 4 hours afterwards. So if you have to learn something, just do a little bit of exercise first and you have a better chance of taking in that information. Another thing that you can do is what we call Wim Hof breathing or super oxygenated breathing, which is not really super oxygenated breathing, but you basically hyperventilate. So you breathe in and out really fast for like 30 times. And what that would do is actually activate that fight or flight response. So you'll realise that after you do that, you feel a bit agitated. That is because your fight or flight system is active, right? It means it's working. We can think of other ways to activate our fight or flight response, and we can use exogenous substances or drugs or neurotropics, as they might call them, in order to actually activate those pathways in the brain. So caffeine is a classic one. It enhances our alertness. It also enhances the effect of the neurotransmitter dopamine, once again. So that is my molecule of motivation, essentially. So you have a better chance of being able to learn things afterwards, but that is provided that you are used to having caffeine. So if you don't have a tolerance to caffeine, this is probably not going to be good for you. There's another thing that you can take called L-tyrosine, which is a precursor to dopamine, which you can have in capsule form, which might be useful as well if that's your jam. Another thing is nicotine. So nicotine directly leads to dopamine being released in the brain. So I'm not condoning the use of nicotine. I'm just saying that if you understand the mechanisms say that taking nicotine can actually enhance your learning. So if that is something that you already take, then potentially you can have an advantage with learning. Other things, for example, include Ritalin, so for ADHD, or modafinil, which is a drug that people use if you've got narcolepsy, the sleeping disorder. Those drugs also increase the amount of adrenaline and dopamine in your brain. So again, I'm not condoning the use of medications to improve alertness and focus. However, it is important to say that based on the mechanisms in the brain, that these are approaches that you can use. But I guess the really interesting thing is, what can we actually do in our lives which doesn't involve medication that can allow us to learn better? White noise. So you're all familiar with the concept of white noise, that buzzing sound. You can actually use white noise to help you learn better. So that the white noise needs to be loud enough to be annoying. So it can't be like quiet enough that it peters into the background and as background noise to you. But if it's loud enough that you feel a bit irritated, that irritated feeling is your fight or flight system being active, right? So your body is then primed to then learn whatever you do next. Now the catch here is listening to white noise is actually quite damaging and detrimental to the development of young children. So adults, this is great, but if you're under the age of 5, you do want to avoid children being around white noise. Another thing that you can do to open up your brain for plasticity so you can learn better is to literally focus. Literally use your eyes to focus on something. So we know that if you're relaxed, our pupils change, the shape of our lens changes, and we can actually see more clearly the things around us. The reverse is also true. So if you're aroused, if your fight or flight system is active, you get tunnel vision. The shape of your lenses changes and you can see clearly what is directly in front of you. And that serves a purpose. So for example, if you are trying to escape a situation, you want to see very clearly where you are running so that way you can survive or escape that situation. And it makes sense. So the reverse is also true. So if you were to look at something, focus on any point, your fight or flight system will also become active. Now, if we think about it, say you're in a forest and you see rustling of the leaves. So you look at the rustling of the leaves and you focus on it. That is going to make your fight or flight system active. It's preparing you because you don't know whether that might be a threat. So your body is preparing yourself. So the way that we can actually use this in practice, in reality, if we're going to learn, is say you're working on your laptop, focus on the corner of your screen for 10 to 50 seconds. Don't blink, just focus on it. And you'll realise that you start to feel a little bit agitated. That's because your fight or flight system is active and it's preparing you to learn or to deal with whatever situation you face with next. It's a really easy thing that we can all implement if we're trying to learn something. Okay, so remember how I said the neurotransmitter dopamine is really important for neuroplasticity? So dopamine is about motivation. It's about driving us towards a reward, whatever that reward might be. It's telling us, hey, you're on the right track, keep doing this thing. It's going to end in a good result for you. So the more you have that thing that you're striving for, the less dopamine your brain releases. Let's have a think about this. It's the same concept that happens in addiction, right? So you have a drug. It doesn't even have to be a drug of misuse like cocaine. It could be a thing you love, like a person. So the more you keep having that thing, whether it be cocaine or a person you love, your brain keeps releasing this dopamine, but the more you have it, the less dopamine it releases. So that's why you actually fall out of the honeymoon period with someone, because you can't have more than 24/7 hours with one person. So in the case of a drug, people just take more of the drug to release more dopamine. So what does this have to do with learning? Well, we can actually use this knowledge to help us to learn better. So if we're trying to learn something, often what we might do is we try and reward ourselves with a piece of chocolate or a glass of wine after we've studied because it feels nice. But if we keep rewarding ourselves, it makes it harder for us to be motivated to keep learning, right? So the best way to navigate that is to maybe only reward yourself sometimes, or even better, don't reward yourself at all. See, the idea of participation certificates for people is the worst thing that you can do, because you're rewarding an activity that hasn't necessarily been something that you're striving for. So the more we expect to have a reward from our actions, the more potent the reward would need to be in order for us to still be motivated to learn or to do the thing. Now, this is something that I think many of us have dealt with. Like, speaking of, I'll take my phone out of my pocket. So we're designed to focus on one thing. Our brain is really not meant to be switching context and looking at lots of new information at once. And unfortunately, social media does that. When you were looking at social media, we're seeing lots and lots of new different information constantly. We are not designed for that. And in fact, this study from, I think, 2014, it's not even new research anymore. What they did is they found that adolescents using their phones for more than 1 hour had significant losses in their ability to focus. So the inattention, there was significant increase in inattention. Just 60 minutes on social media on your phones per day. That's, I think the majority of people who use phones would find that they spend a lot more than that. Now that's for adolescents. We don't know what amount adults could probably get away with without losing attention or having a decrease in their attention span. But if I was to extrapolate, I'd say maybe a couple of hours, maybe 2 to 3 hours, just because adult brains are less adaptable. They're a bit more fixed in the way that they work. Okay, so we know that focus is hard work. You have that agitated feeling because your fight or flight system is active. If that's active, that's a great space to be in for learning. Another thing that we can do to improve learning is to make mistakes. So making mistakes actually has quite a profound effect on our brain and how our brain works. So let's look into this in a bit more detail. So making mistakes is one of the best things that you can do for learning. It promotes neuroplasticity. So without mistakes, the brain can't change itself. And why would it? If it's not making a mistake, it's basically saying there's nothing wrong with this situation right now. Why would I want to change if I'm not making mistakes? So there's a biological reason why making a mistake feels a bit gross. Again, it's activating that fight or flight response, okay? So when you make a mistake, you're activating that fight or flight response, dopamine is being released in the brain, and you are primed to then learn whatever it is that you do next. So making mistakes is great, provided you continue to learn, continue to sit down and work on whatever problem it is that you're working on. So if you make a mistake, keep learning, don't walk away, and you'll better see why in a moment. So this is a study that a colleague shared on social media the other day. It says first year students' math anxiety predicts STEM, so science, technology, education and mathematics avoidance, and underperformance throughout university, independent of maths ability. Basically what it's saying is if you do poorly in maths, you're going to do poorly in everything else. And now knowing what we know about mistakes, we can understand why. So making a mistake primes our brain for whatever it is that we do next. If you make a mistake, for example, in your mathematics, and then you walk away, you are priming your brain to associate anxiety, to associate mistakes with anxiety and walking away. And you're going to keep doing that for everything else that you do. So everything else that you try to learn, making mistakes in that space, you will want to walk away as well. So I think the take-home message is, when you make a mistake and you feel anxious, stick with it, keep going, because it's your brain's way of preparing you to learn whatever it is that you do next. So before I said failing, now I said falling. This might sound a bit strange, but our posture is actually critical to our learning as well. So you don't want to be falling all over the place. You know, how are you going to survive if you can't walk from A to B? So one of the things that's really important for training our brain and for switching on this neuroplasticity is the ability to keep upright. So if you were to challenge yourself by moving your body around in different directions, for example, if you're dancing or doing yoga, you're actually triggering your semicircular canals in your ears to detect your body position. And when that happens, when you're detecting that your body's in an unusual position, you're essentially opening up this window for plasticity. So, for example, if you're doing yoga or if you're doing dancing and you're challenging your body position in different ways, you'll be opening up that window for plasticity. But as soon as you get practiced at whatever that activity is, like dancing, like yoga, there will be a point where your body is used to being challenged by these different body positions and it won't have the same effect. But it will work at least for a little while. Okay, so what's the next ingredient? We've talked about neuroplasticity, we've talked about making mistakes, now repetition. So this is probably a pretty intuitive one that we already think about. Basically, repetition. Do as many of the thing as you can in a restricted amount of time. So, you know, just like exercising builds muscle, repetition or repetitive ways of doing things will strengthen those pathways in the brain. It'll make those highways that I was talking about. So when you're doing that, remember, make mistakes as well. Challenge yourself. For example, if you're practicing basketball and shooting for the hoop, don't just do as many of those as you can in one direction. Challenge yourself by using different body directions and make mistakes in that training period, because the more mistakes that you're making and the more of those repetitions that you're doing, the better chance you'll have at learning and doing better. Another interesting study shows that you can also do repetitions when you're doing nothing, which sounds a bit strange. So what this study did is they basically recorded from the memory part of the brain called the hippocampus, and they found that when you're sitting there for 10 seconds, just taking a quiet break after whatever it is that you were learning, when you're sitting there for 10 seconds, you're actually replaying, you're having that repetition in your mind. So you're repeating those actions. And when you're doing that, again, it's repetition, which means you have a better chance of learning and consolidating that information. So you train, you take a 10-second break, and you're still recalling that information. So I think the take-home message there is, if you're practicing or you're trying to learn something, don't just run off afterwards and do something else. Take a moment to sit there and just think about the exercise, the activity, the thing that you were trying to learn. So taking breaks is just as important as doing the thing that you're trying to learn. And expanding on those little breaks, we also know that taking 10 to 20 minute breaks and just in complete stillness, for example, using mindfulness or meditation, you're also recalling those things, that you're also recalling that activity. You're recalling the thing that you were trying to learn. You're recalling the dance moves, the cricket moves, the language. So having that still time after your learning bout is going to be really advantageous in helping you to learn better. Even having a nap is also really good. So if you have a 20-minute nap after you spend some time learning, that's fantastic as well, because sleep actually happens to be one of the most important things for consolidating the things that we do as we learn. So we used to think that sleep was a bit of a waste of time. You know, we spend a third of our lives in this sort of state of suspended animation. But it turns out that sleep serves a constellation of functions which help us to live and to be healthy. For example, it's resetting our immune system. It's helping us learn. It's helping us reset our emotional control. It's helping us remove the waste in our brain. It's helping us improve our problem solving. It's helping us reset our metabolism. It's even helping our immune system make more antibodies. So we know, for example, if you take the flu vaccine and you sleep well, you'll make way more antibodies than if you don't sleep well. So there are so many different things that are happening when we sleep that is crucial, not just for our ability to learn, but for for our body to work most effectively. So let's have a look at what's happening when we're sleeping. So when we do things during the day, we're using part of our brain called the hippocampus to keep track of what we're doing from minute to minute. So it's a bit like a diary. If I was to ask you what you were doing before you came into this room, you would be using your hippocampus to recall that information, right? So it's only keeping memories there for about a day. And what happens is when you sleep, those short-term memories, those things that you've done, those things that you've learnt, then get transferred into long-term memories. So the rewiring and the consolidation of everything that you've done only happens when you sleep. So if you don't sleep, that doesn't happen. You lose all of that hard work, all of those things that you've learned throughout the course of the day. So this is why sleeping is one of the best things that you can do to enhance your learning, because the evidence says that you're replaying those learnt things while you're sleeping. So you really need to be prioritising your sleep if you want to learn well and learn better. Let's have a look at what is happening when we sleep. So we have what we call a sleep cycle, and it's just like the ultradian cycle I mentioned before. It's this 90-minute in and out, dipping in from REM sleep, so our shallow sleep, into deep sleep, otherwise known as our non-REM sleep. So we have that similar pattern happening in wakefulness, that ultradian cycle. Let me explain a little bit more about what's happening here. So there are a few major neurotransmitters involved, which you can see there on the left-hand side, and I'll explain those a little bit more detail in just a moment. So REM sleep is the stage of sleep where our dreams are happening, or most of our dreams are happening. So everything that we've tried to memorize or learn through the course of the day gets turned into long-term memories during that stage of sleep. So especially things that are involved with emotions. So you might realize that if you've had a really short night of sleep, say only 6 hours, you won't have had a lot of that REM sleep. So if REM is really important for emotional control, you can imagine you're going to be really quite emotional if you don't have a full night's sleep. So we know that that is really important for those emotional learning component of our sleep. Another thing to consider is the non-REM or the deep sleep, which is down the bottom there. So what's happening in that non-REM sleep is a lot of the actions, so the motor learning. If you're learning a new sport, that is when that part of your memory, that part of your learning is becoming consolidated. So we know that during that stage of sleep, you don't really have any noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is really important for movement. So, I think I've mixed that up. Yes, sorry, never mind. So during that non-REM phase of sleep, you've got a little bit of that noradrenaline happening, which is why we have that motor action. And that's why you can actually toss and turn during that stage of sleep. You can't toss and turn during REM sleep because there's no noradrenaline, which is that neurotransmitter involved in movement. So you're quite paralysed during the REM stage of sleep. So you're probably wondering how much sleep you need. For people our age, it's about 7 to 9 hours. And I guess the long story short is the older you get, the less sleep that you need. And if you only sleep 5 to 6 hours, we know that you have a 70% reduction in what we call our natural killer cells, which are cells that are involved in fighting cancer and those sorts of things. So that's why you have a hugely increased risk of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and bowel cancer if you're not getting that right amount of sleep every night. In fact, it's why the World Health Organization has actually said that shift work is a probable carcinogen, because people who don't get enough sleep are actually are making less of these anti-cancer fighting cells. How am I going for time? A little bit. Okay. So I guess the question is, how can we sleep better? So there are a few things that we need to think about. Light is really important for kickstarting our circadian rhythm, so our sleep cycle, but it's really important that we have the right kind of light early in the day. So not phone screen light, not TV screen light, it needs to be daylight. You want to have between 2 and 10 minutes of daylight as soon as you wake up in order to kickstart that circadian rhythm. And that's because daylight is so much more brighter than a phone screen. So for example, a phone screen might have 1 to 5,000 lux, which is a measurement of brightness, whereas daylight will have about 100,000 lux. So the effect on your brain is going to be a much, much bigger. You've probably also heard about blue light and how blue light is bad for sleep. So blue light is the kind of light that you often have coming from your phone screens. And we know that blue light can delay your sleep by 5 to 40 minutes, depending on the individual. Just 5 minutes can delay your sleep by 5 to 40 minutes. So that's a huge thing to consider. Late at night, avoid those blue screens or use blue light blocking glasses to help avoid that impact of blue light on your ability to sleep. Another thing to consider is it's not just blue light that's bad. Any light is bad. It's just that our eyes are most sensitive to blue light late at night. So you want to avoid any kind of bright light if you can. Whoops. Another thing is the direction of light also matters. So to minimize the influence of, let's bring that down. So the direction of light also matters. So let's think about it like this. We know that the brain essentially considers the angle of light as an important way of activating your alertness. So if you have a light coming from above you, it's the same signal to your brain as saying, hey, it's daylight, it's the middle of the day, be alert. That's why having down lights at night can be actually really stimulating and keep you awake. So one thing you might want to do is to have down lights in the evening, so that way it has less of an effect on your ability to sleep later. So the angle of light is also really important. Other things that affect our sleep are alcohol. It's a pretty big one. So we know that alcohol can make you a bit more drowsy, so you might find it easier to get to sleep, but you wake up many more times throughout the course of the night, so you end up having much poorer quality sleep. What you eat can also affect your ability to sleep well. So if anyone's on a ketogenic diet, if that's familiar to you, that's going to make it a lot harder for you to sleep. We know that having more carbs before bed can actually help calm you and help you to sleep better. So that might be something worth considering. And stress. Stress is really bad for sleep. One of the things that keeps us awake is cortisol, our stress hormone. So cortisol, our stress hormone, is actually the hormone that wakes you up in the morning. So you definitely don't want to have lots of stress hormones at night, because it's going to keep you awake and it's going to make you wake up more times throughout the course of the night as well. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the ingredients for learning, neuroplasticity, making mistakes, repeating, using sleep to rewire your brain. But I've also added a new word there, neurogenesis. Neurogenesis means making new brain cells. And the reason why I've only added it in just now is because it's a little bit contentious. So we know that as we get older, we do make new brain cells, but how much is still a topic of contention. So the work that I'm going to show you now is what we've learnt from rats and mice. I'm sure we can apply a lot of it though to humans. So all that said, we do make new brain cells, and the more new brain cells you make, the more potential you have to learn and, I guess, make new memories. So how do we make new brain cells? Well, exercise is one of the most powerful stimulants of new brain cells that we know of. So among many things, exercise basically increases the amount of brain fertilizer or growth factors in the brain, making the new brain cells healthier and survive better. It also releases endorphins, which makes you feel good. And of course, it's making these new brain cells. So it has lots of important effects on the brain. And as I mentioned before, exercise also increases your focus and attention for 2 to 4 hours after doing some exercise. So it's really great for so many different things. You're probably wondering how much the optimal minimum amount of exercise is. We don't really know at this point, and it's probably going to be very individual, but about 30 minutes of cardiovascular exercise every other day is something that you would at least want as a minimum. We also know that changing your diet by reducing your calorie intake by 20 to 30%, or having intermittent fasting can actually increase the formation of these new brain cells as well. So spacing the time between your meals can actually help you make new brain cells. And it's not just spacing your meals, it's also the type of food that you eat as well. So we know that food that's really high in sugars is also going to reduce this formation of new brain cells. So sugary foods are not good for your brain for so many different reasons. And it's not just what you eat, it's also the texture of the food you eat. So we know that food that is quite mushy, that you don't have to really chew, can actually decrease the formation of new brain cells as well, which is something that we don't really think about. Chewing is a really important thing for our brain as well. Socializing is so important for our brains. In fact, for over 50 years, we've known that people who are more socially isolated are more likely to die. So there's a 29% increase in mortality if you are socially isolated. So it has quite profound effects on the brain. Sex is also good for your brain, makes your brain release oxytocin. So if you're getting some, great. Sleep is also incredibly important as well, as I've mentioned. So it helps make those new brain cells. If you're not sleeping, you're not going to be making those new brain cells as effectively. And actually antidepressants are really important as well. So obviously it's only relevant if you're suffering from clinical depression and you're having it managed by a doctor with medication. But we do know that in depression, parts of the brain are shrinking. And part of the reason for why these antidepressants work is they help make these new brain cells. So we know that antidepressant medications often take about 2 weeks to start working. And that's also how long it takes for new brain cells to become integrated into the brain, which I think is quite interesting. So we talked about all the critical ingredients for learning. I know it was a lot of information. I talked a lot about different neurotransmitters, but I think we really need to work pretty hard to open up the window of plasticity in our brain if we want to learn later in life. And there are lots of different ways that we can do that. So I'd like to recommend trying to do your practice or your training in 8 to 30-minute bouts, preferably having a few hours break in between, having quiet time, having either a nap or 10-second breaks after depending what it is that you're learning. Other things are making sure you activate that fight or flight system. You might want to use white noise, you might want to use exercise, you might want to use that visual focus technique, so focusing on a spot for 10 to 50 seconds and not blinking. That'll help activate that fight or flight system. Make mistakes. Do make mistakes, because mistakes are going to help you to learn. That awkward feeling of making a mistake, that agitation, is your fight or flight response being active, and it's helping you to learn whatever it is that you do next. Obviously, do repetitions, do as much repetitions as you can per unit time in your training period, and do take those breaks. And remember, you have to sleep. So that actual rewiring only happens when we're sleeping. And lastly, there are lots of different things that we can do to help make new brain cells, at least in theory, and that is exercise, calorie restriction, socializing, all those important things. So while parts of our abilities are predetermined by genetics, there's a lot of things that we can do to help optimize our brain's ability to change and to learn and to be its best. So hopefully understanding how the brain works can ultimately make your ability to learn much easier. Thank you very much.
Lila, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
So I'm sure that people have been listening very intently and remembering all the good things they can do. And I wonder if there are some questions from the floor. Remember, people watching via Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And our Zoom expert today, Dr. Robert Johnson, will relay those to us. Thank you. Jocelyn.
I feel like I should have made everyone run around before this.
Yes, that's right. We should have just taken a 10-second break.
Yes.
Yes.
Take that information. Are we on? Is this working? Okay.
So, Lila, I am just interested in how you actually conduct your research. You mentioned at one point using the rat brain as an analogue for the human brain. Is that essentially what's involved?
Okay. So this is a summary of other people's research. This is not specifically my research. This is a huge body of research from around the world. I think there's a lot of questions that that is very difficult to answer in the human brain. So, for example, the ability to know whether there's new brain cells being made after exercise. We don't have the opportunity to look inside a person's brain after they've done exercise. You have to use post-mortem tissue for that. So there's a lot of questions that we can't ask using the human brain, and we have to use animals as an analogue to get that information. But certainly our abilities to record from the brain, from human brains, is the technology is becoming in leaps and bounds. So, for example, one of those studies that I was showing, people who were recording from the hippocampus, and they could actually see that you were recalling that information during those 10-second breaks. So we can do that, but at this point, a lot of the questions that we want to answer can't be done in human brains. So that's why we need both of those two analogues to sort of help us understand what's going on.
Thank you very much, Lila. And for people who are here in person today, we do have a roaming mic. So yes, thank you very much. One of our members will pass that to you. Thank you. Narelle.
On your model and the way you're explaining things, how do you see dementia?
Oh, dementia is an interesting one. So I guess what's happening in dementia is different neurons in the brain, so the brain cells are dying. And as they're dying, the information that they're storing, the things that you've learnt, those memories become eroded away. And we know that in dementia, certain parts of the brain are more vulnerable. So typically our hippocampus, that diary that I was talking about, tends to be one of the more vulnerable parts of the brain. And if your hippocampus isn't working, you're not able to hold those short-term memories in place. So if you can't hold those short-term memories in place, not only do you not know what's happening to you in space and time, can you imagine being here and suddenly not remembering why you were here, how you got here, or any of that information? So not having a hippocampus that works effectively makes it impossible to really have a sense of where you are in space and time. And if you're not holding those short-term memories, you can't make long-term memories either. So you also can't form long-term memories either. So I think it's a really interesting concept. And we've got a long way to go into really understanding what's happening in the brain with dementia. There's so much research being done, but the more research we do, the more we realise that a lot of the hypotheses we had about what is happening in the brain in dementia is actually incorrect. So in dementia, one of the leading things that happens is there's a particular protein in the brain called beta amyloid, which we had always thought was the cause of dementia. Now we're coming to realise that other things are happening in the brain to make this beta amyloid be there. So we need to be targeting those other things, not the beta amyloid. I digress, sorry.
No, that's extremely interesting. Thank you. Roxanne?
Hi, Lila. You mentioned things that teachers with experience learn. So repetition, 30 minutes, and then have a bit of exercise and that. And I'm just wondering, the new thing about errors, making mistakes, that's a huge thing that people, particularly children, worry about, the perfectionists and just about everybody. So my question is, are you supporting, informing the teacher training at UTAS to give the new teachers this information before they have to do 10 years teaching, and have you included the error information up front? Because I know myself, I would have really appreciated that information at the beginning of my career rather than towards the end.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think there's certainly conversations that need to be had with the university about bringing this knowledge, this neuroscience into teaching pedagogy, because it doesn't really exist at this point. And it's so interesting to know that making mistakes is helping us to learn better, because often we would feel anxious and not want to learn anymore and want to walk away. So I think it's really a bit of a paradigm shift in the way we think about learning.
And I think that the joy is when you say to a child, guess what you did, make a mistake. Your brain has made all those neuro connections, and then their face lights up, and it's like, oh, it was okay to make that error.
Yeah.
I think that is so powerful as a teacher
Mhm.
to give to the students. We really need to be doing that
Yeah.
from pre-kinder.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Really.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you. Is there another question? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a teacher too, so I'm just really interested in that whole getting the stress mechanism though, because we're also told you can't have too much stress because the frontal lobe will close down.
Yes.
So how do we get that good zone of like just enough stress that you've got that learning going on, but not too much where it's like curtains?
Yeah.
Or like, and is there research coming out about that?
That's such a fantastic question. So we know that you need to have your fight or flight system active to learn well, but if you have it too active, as you said, your frontal lobe you can't access that decision-making process. So you can't think clearly and you can't make the right decisions. Look, I think it's a very individualistic thing, and I think it's one of those things that we as ourselves have to be aware of to know whether we're overstimulated, too alert, and whether we need to do something to calm ourselves down. And one thing that we can do really easily to help calm ourselves down, just enough, is a certain type of breathing. So it's called the physiological sigh. So 2 quick inhales and a long exhale. So that turns off our fight or flight system, so it helps us to be a little bit more relaxed. But I mean, you'd have to know whether you're a bit too aroused and whether you needed that in order to focus properly. But it's certainly something that if we have like a child in our class that is clearly a little bit too agitated, that's something that we can actually put into practice and help them be a bit more relaxed and have a better chance of learning. But I don't have an answer because it's not a one thing fits all.
It's fascinating, Lila. Thank you. Are there any questions from our members online? Not at the moment. Thank you. Okay, final question from Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything conceptually or practically different between learning facts and learning actions?
Well, yeah, see, learning movements is easier in a sense that you can just keep repeating the thing. You know, it's an action. And that stage of memory consolidation happens during deep sleep, whereas the facts and the information happens during the REM sleep. So they are quite distinctly different, and they are processed by the brain in different ways.
Another interesting thing to think about. Thank you. So I'd like to invite our Vice President, Professor Jocelyn McPhee, to come forward, and also thank Dr. Deborah Beswick for handing our roaming mic around. Thank you very much, Deborah. So if you'd just like to remain there for a moment, Lila, please.
So my role now, Lila, is to offer our thanks. That was a terrific talk, and I could just feel the neurons connecting the whole time. And I'm sure I wasn't alone, but truly this is quite revolutionary to have spelt out so clearly what are reasonably simple ways that we can do things differently for much greater benefit. And thanks for all the effort that you put into it. You can't do that without spending a lot of time and thinking carefully about how to communicate what I'm sure at your level is really complicated information. So please accept our thanks, and just as a small token and something to help you remember
Thank you so much.
This exercise. So I'll ask everybody to join me in thanking Lila for her lecture.